Okay. Shall I start?
Yeah, perfect. The floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for this invite to hold this presentation. And I mean, this presentation is going to be very different with respect to Mara's presentation in the sense that it's more, let's say, brainstorming ideas on research work in ontologies for the digital humanities. I will specifically talk about actually a specific topic, which has to do with the representation of points of view or interpretations in the context of work related to the ontologies. And then I will address some challenges with respect to all of this. So there is not really a lot about stable work or application that we could already use, I think. But let's see what you think about this. Yeah, well, I mean, concerning myself, Kasia has already said something, but I mean, I'm a researcher at the National Research Council of Italy, and I'm affiliated to the Laboratory for Applied Ontology, which is mainly based in Trento. But I'm also part of the institute, which is of the same institute at the CNR, which is based in Catania, is in the south of the country. Okay, so I mean, first of all, I should say something, since this is a presentation about ontologies for the digital humanities, I should say something about what are the digital humanities. Now, actually, this is a topic on its own with a kind of hot debate within the community. So as you can see here in this really recent publication by O'Sullivan, it says that we might see a day when arguments about the age, its parameters, intellectual and pedagogical purposes are no longer in vogue, but we are not yet there. So actually, there is a debate about what we understand as digital for digital humanities. So I will not go really into this topic now. I just take a point of view which I would say is widely shared within the community, which is that for which we can conceive digital humanities as a research and application area at the intersection between computer science and the human sciences. And so the purpose is to apply formal and computational methods in humanistic research in order to let's say, ask novel research questions about maybe old research topics. So how do we deal with text? How do we deal with the representation of music? Etc., etc. I mean, if you explore a little bit this publication, you will really find a lot of discussion about the topic. Now, I mean, in general, ontologies in the context of the DH are broadly applied, especially in the case of semantic web, the semantic web space. So here the idea it's always the same as Mara was said before. I mean, people use ontology for managing data and integrating databases of different sorts. So you can explore some of these links by your own. I will share the slides. You can find information about music, like what we have in the Carnegie Hall data, or you might explore information data about archaeology, as the Open Archeo in this case, or you can explore more larger libraries, like in the context of Europeana, or the DPLA in the US, where you find lots of different data related to cultural heritage, represented in terms of a certain specific ontology. So there is a really broad use of this technology and these models in the landscape. Giving, let's say, a review of the state of the art would be really demanding, and it is really outside, let's say, 30 minutes, what we can do in 30 minutes here. So I just want to point you some references. So there has been recently some special issue in international journals like JOC and the Semantic Web. Actually, as you can see here, the Semantic Web has promoted two special issue, really one after the other, which really, I mean, tells that this is a really lovely community for the use of ontology for cultural heritage, digital humanities in a broad general sense. Actually, within the community of the association, the EIA, there is a workshop series which is called Swatch. It was held in 2021 in the context of Jobo. And so you can also browse the proceeding in order to see a little bit of discussions that researchers and stakeholders have when dealing with in this application domain. Just a quick reference to SciDoc CRM. I mean, if you are working in this context, this is probably the ontology that you might want to look at, because this is the reference which is used in the community. This is actually a project which started many years ago. It's maybe something like 30 years ago or even more. It is supported by the International Council of the Museum. It's an ISO standard. This is also why it's broadly used by many museums and many different stakeholders. It is constantly reviewed and updated on the basis of community discussion and user feedbacks. The main person behind it is Martin Dorr, who has also who has published, several papers, and there is a presentation of the ontology in the Handbook of Ontology published in 2009. So these are really the places where you might want to look if you're interested into this kind of model. Now, let's start with the brainstorming session. Most of the research that is actually done in the landscape of ontology engineering applied to the digital humanities, as far as I can tell, concerns the representation of domain entities, let's say, of different sorts, which could be artworks of fine arts, like could be historical events, musical composition, musical performances, literary text, etc., etc. So here, for instance, I'm showing the Sparkle endpoint of the Carnegie Hall data, where you find information and data about performances and when they took place, who was the conductor, and many different data related to the performances. But actually, something which is very important in the human sciences is the representation, is the expression, let's say, of a point of view about a domain entity. So if you think about literary criticism or musicological criticism or that work which is done in general in the performing arts, there is a lot of materials, a lot of research which is about the expression of a scholarly interpretation of a critical point of view, okay, about the music or about the text, about the piece of theater that was staged in a certain theater, and so on and so forth. And of course, we have lots of different materials about interpretations, both in, let's say, scholarly essays, like the work that scholars do in academia, but also data that you can find in newspaper reviews. So scholars, critics, they go to concert and then they make a review in a newspaper. So the representation, of course, the expression and the representation of this data, critical data or interpretive data, observational data, how we want to call them, plays a significant role if we really want to contribute, let's say, to create a dialogue, okay, between computer science on the one hand and digital and humanities in general on the other end. So it's not only about domain entities, it's also about what people think about these entities. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I think that there is some interest in research and application for the development of models able to represent points of view. And in my view, this could be seen as a sort of integration between traditional discussion in ontology, in philosophical ontologies, and in epistemology, in the sense that we want to represent a domain, so we want to represent what exists, let's say, in a domain, but we want also to represent what scholars, what people, what critics think about the entities of this domain. So this is a topic where the two, let's say, fields kind of merge together. Something which we need to take into account when dealing with this topics in general is that, of course, there can be multiple observations, multiple points of view, okay, about the same entity. So take, for instance, a musical performance. There can be, of course, multiple points of view about the same performance. This observation, most of the time, especially when they are done from the scholarly community, they are formulated, they are expressed through different theoretical apparatuses, from different theoretical background. For instance, in literatures, you can take the point of view of scholars working with psychology, or scholars working from a gender-driven studies or from a cultural studies point of view, or from the point of view of Marxism and so on. So there are different approaches for the expression of a point of view. And sometimes, of course, I mean, this point of view can be conflicting with each other. So it's quite common actually in the human sciences that the scholars intentionally argue against the position of someone else. So they really want to rise conflicts, let's say, in the scholarly sense. Okay, they do not fight in the physical sense, but still in the intellectual sense, these kind of things are quite common. So I will talk now about three different approaches, which I think are very interesting and have been recently proposed in order to deal with the representation of interpretation, observations, point of view, whatever. I selected these three here basically because they have been applied in digital humanities context and because they are based on foundational work and foundational theories. There are also other references. You can find here in the slide something, so you can explore this if you're interested. Now, the first approach is actually based on SciDoc CRM, and this is more specifically, it's based on this paper by Dore and colleague in 2011. So this is a very interesting paper. I would recommend you to read this if you're interested in the modeling of, again, of observation. And here, I mean, here the authors address topics which, in my view, are really, let's say, valid, are still valid in the landscape of contemporary research about this, about the subject. So again, I mean, what they say is that we have lots of data about domain entities, but of course, I mean, we also want to represent points of view about them. And then they start proposing a model, which was then further developed in an extension of SciDoc, which is called the CRM-INF. I think that the acronym stands for argumentation model or something like this. So this is the main, let's say, pattern behind CRM-INF. So essentially what this says is that actors, okay, so which can be either single persons or groups, okay, they carry out argumentation activities, so they carry out processes of argumentation, okay, through which they conclude a certain belief, which has a certain content, okay, and a certain value. So for instance, during, let's say, I perform an argumentation activity to which I formulate a certain belief, okay? And the content, let's say, of the belief, so what I argue in my argumentation is represented through a proposition set, okay? So I'm arguing something, let's say. The belief value can be something like I attribute to my belief the thing is that it is true or it is false because I'm reviewing my belief and attributing to it a false belief value. Or I can attribute it a probabilistic value because I'm expressing an hypothesis and I'm not sure 100% if it is true or if it is false with respect to the phenomena that I'm investigating. Okay, something to be stressed here, and this is why I put a quotation mark, an exclamation mark, is that activities and argumentation, they can be carried out by both individual agents, as I said before, or groups of agents. So a belief can either be the belief of a single person or of a community, of agents, of a communities of interpreters. This is also something which I think is interesting in the scope of this model because it allows the documentation of inference-making processes. So in the sense that we want to document that a scholar can use certain premises in order to conclude something, okay? So there is an inference-making process that we are documenting in this case. As far as I understand, I mean, this model is not meant to calculate, let's say, inferences in the sense of a formal system, like a formal logic. I mean, this is meant to document. Okay, we want to document the reasoning of a certain scholar. Okay, so we say he started or she started with this set of premises, and they reached this conclusion. Okay. Some comments about this approach. I mean, of course, belief is a quite central notion because this is always the conclusion of something or the premise of something. So of course, I mean, from an ontological point of view, the question that arises is what are beliefs in this model? And the point of view put forward by the authors is to conceive a belief with mental states, okay? Agents' mental states. So of course, they understand that this can be a problem because how do we access other mental states, right? So if we want to represent in an information system what someone thought about a certain entity, I mean, we need to be able to access their belief as mental states. This can be, this of course can be a problem. So what Dor and colleagues says is that argumentation and belief, they are made public, okay, and they have to be comprehensible in the course of a communication process, right? So as I understand this model, I mean, the overall assumption is that there are communication processes through which beliefs are made explicit. I cannot find these communication processes in the scope of the model, right? So I understand that this is a mentalistic approach in the way in which it is modeled, right? I mean, communication process should be represented; they are not there. Beliefs that still conceived as mental entities, right? So the overall approach seems to rely on a mentalistic attitude for the representation of argumentations and their results. There is also something interesting, I think, to be said concerning groups, in the sense that we are saying that a belief can be also the belief of a group. Now, there is a lot of research, as you probably know, concerning collective intentionality when we deal with group, what a group think, and what is the, let's say, shared view within a group. This, I think, it's a bit underdeveloped in the scope of CRM-Inf, in the sense that there is not much information about how these systematically work. And in particular, I mean, if beliefs are understood as mental entities, I mean, in which sense does a group have a mental entity, right? So this is something that I think requires more work and then more deeper investigation about social ontology, groups, collective intentionalities, and so on and so forth. Okay, so moving to the second approach, this is general work always proposed in the context of digital humanities with respect to an ontology which is called ARCO, and it has been applied to the modeling of heritage, of cultural heritage in the Italian community. Now here the pattern, it's based on the representation of what they call situations. So a situation is something like a state of affair. So it captures reality, okay, at a certain time. And a situation is also a piece of the world which match with a certain description, right? So we have the description of a state of affair, and then we have the corresponding state of affair. And then the author have the notion of interpretation, okay, which is a subclass of situation, as you can see here from the model. An example is authorship attribution. So for instance, there are cases where we do not know who is the author of a certain text or of a certain musical composition, right? So scholars express points of view about this. Now, what we are told in the scope of this model is that this can be represented through a situation, okay, which they also call an epistemological situation, okay, where someone attributes a certain person as being the author, okay, of a certain text. And again, I mean, this situation where, let's say, I don't know, I'm the author of a certain book, is satisfy a certain description, which could be something like a scholarly essay, a scholarly document, where this claim is done. So the interpretation criterion, the description could be the document, could be the essay, right? While the situation, it's the formal representation of me as being the author of this book. Now, this general pattern that I just introduced has been extended and has been applied in a specific context, in the specific context of iconographical interpretation by Sartini and colleagues in two recent publications. Now, one of these has been also awarded with the best paper award in the context of the last edition of Swatch. So this is interesting work. I would recommend you to have a look at this paper if you're interested in works concerning especially iconographical representation. What is also interesting, I mean, what is interesting in this approach is that the author embed within the general theory a specific interpretive approach, which is the one by Erwin Panofsky. So what they can do now is to provide an interpretation of an interpretation of iconographies, right? In terms of the aesthetic theory of Panofsky. As I said, I mean, this is really interesting from a humanistic point of view, because an expression, I mean, an observation, an interpretation, it's always given in terms of a certain background theory. Okay, so now here the authors say we want to interpret iconographies, and we want to do this in terms of a certain approach, again, which is the one by Panofsky. I mean, with respect to CRM-INF, interpretation here are not mental entities, so they can be intersubjectively accessed, okay? There is not an emphasis on the documentation of formal or informal reasoning, as it was done in the other model. And again, I mean, it allows for an explicit representation of the interpretive theory behind the expression of observations. Of course, I mean, the open question that one might arise here is, what do we do when we want to work with multiple theories, right? We might want to develop an information systems which is able to take into account multiple point of view expressed in terms of different theoretical approaches. So what do we do in this case? This is not a topic which is addressed by the author. Also, I have to say that from a methodological point of view, the authors, I mean, in this paper, they do not really explain how they can embed, let's say, a theory into their more general approach. We are presented with the ontology based on Panofsky, but we are not saying how an interpretive theory can be, let's say, plugged into the system and adjust to our maybe different theoretical requirements. Now, the third approach that I'm going to discuss is proposed by Massolo and colleagues. I mean, here an observation is conceived as the attribution of a property to a certain entity as a result of a certain process, which could be a cognitive process, a scholarly process, or from a scientific point of view, a measurement, for instance, process. So, for instance, the fact that a scholar in musicology, on the basis of his studies, attributes, let's say, the genre symphony to a certain composition. Okay, so say, according to me, this is a symphony. So, observations, they are domain entities, as in the previous cases. They are true theories in the sense that they are false, true. They do not necessarily match with how the world is in its own sense. And more importantly, I mean, they are represented through an observational vocabulary, which means that the assumption is that scholars, okay, they have to agree on the way in which observations are expressed. So, for instance, in the context of music, if they want to develop, let's say, something related to genres, right, they need to find an agreement about how they want to classify entities according to to a specific terminology, right? Then they might disagree on the way in which a certain observation is applied to a certain entity, okay? But they have to have a common agreement about the concept that they use. So, for instance, if we talk in the context of the taxonomy about symphony, and we have agreed about the observation kinds, okay, then, I mean, we need to share the same concept of symphony. And then, I mean, as you can see here in this picture, I mean, of course, observation kinds within an observation vocabulary, they can be organized at different level of generality into taxonomies, and they can be formally characterized. So, for instance, here in this example, there is an observation attributing the genre symphony to Beethoven 9 Symphony. Okay, so this is, of course, a simplified representation of the overall approach. Now, with respect to CRM-INF, I mean, these are observation. I mean, in this case, they are not mental entities, so they can be intersubjectively accessed because they are pieces of information representing how the world, how an application domain is conceived. They abstract from observing agents and observing acts, which means that multiple agents, they can express the same observation. I'm running out of time, so I will go quick, and then maybe we can discuss this later. With respect to Carriero, I mean, these two approaches are closer, okay, because they originate, let's say, from common previous work by some of the authors. Although there are subtle distinctions among the two approaches. So first of all, just to say something briefly, the approach in Masol is represented in persuaded logic. There is a quite extended axiomatization, which is not present in Carriero. And this provides a more, let's say, robust framework in order to understand what the author mean with their own approach. There is a way of dealing with multiple and not necessarily compatible observational data. Actually, the author in the publication explored different approaches to deal with incompatible data. And there is also a way to discuss between the link between data and the knowledge which one might have in an ontology. And there is also a way to, again, plug in into the system background interpretive theories. So actually, this is what we did later in a recent publication, which I also co-authored, where we applied this framework in the context of literary studies. So what we did there is that we plug into this overall approach a specific interpretive theory, right? And in this way, I mean, we documented some observation in the context of literary studies, specifically focused on interpretations of literary characters. So actually, I mean, here we extended the framework in order to take into account the provenance of the claims, so who asserted a certain information. And we also have the mechanisms in order to represent a distinction between asserting an observation and rejecting an observation, because this plays a role in the context of these studies. And we also have mechanism in order to support the documentation of some kind of reasoning, in the sense that a scholar might want to support his conclusions through certain premises, okay? So we have a way to document this. And the last word, we also include an approach to start an analysis of observation. So it's not only about documenting observation, but it's also about making comparison about among multiple observations. Very quickly, so in summary, I mean, in the first case, CRM-INF, it is based on the representation of belief as mental entities. So this poses problem about how we access others' belief in a mentalistic attitude, right? In the case of Carriero, this is an approach based on situations, okay? There is not a documentation of inferences, of reasoning procedures, and it is designed in order to implement interpretive theories. Although, as I said before, from a methodological point of view, it's not plain clear how the system can be adjusted to different and to multiple interpretive theory. Finally, in the approach by Masolo, further extended by me and colleagues, I mean, this is based on the idea of having observation languages as shared languages through which we can express public observation. So of course, these are not observation in the sense of mental entities. And there are first steps concerning the analysis and the comparison of multiple observations. Concerning discussion about these let's say, topics, as you can say, I mean, it can go in many different directions. I mean, of course, there is a challenge concerning really the possibility of expressing scholarly arguments through formal models. It is something that when we present this kind of work to scholars in literatures, in music, in performing arts, sometimes, I mean, the reaction is not always so positive, because it's not only a matter of what they say, but it's also a matter of how they make their claims. So there are a lot of linguistic nuances that, as you can imagine, can make a difference when you study, for instance, literature. There is also the difference in how we represent single observers' observation and groups' observations. This has to do with the representation of social groups, collective intentionalities, and so on and so forth. There is also something which has to be taken into account with the evolution of observation. So the fact that scholars can change their mind about a certain subject of study. How do we deal with multiple and incompatible observation, especially when they are expressed through incompatible background theories? Something interesting concerns also the evaluation of an observation with respect to what? Either with respect to reality, if we can make this distinction between an observation and the reality, which is not always so trivial, especially when we deal with the human sciences. But also the attribution of values. Okay, so we want to attribute a relevance measure, let's say, to a certain observation. And then there is also something interesting and challenging concerning the reasoning with this with over observation. And this is challenging because sometimes scholars do not make explicit the, let's say, rules that they adopt to perform their arguments. And sometimes they're really local to a certain scholars or to a certain works. They can be hardly generalized to other cases. And there are other theoretical and application challenges, and we can discuss this during the discussion. So I thank you very much for listening. Just to say that this is also partially based on some research projects, and you might want to explore this by yourself. Thank you. I would be glad to take questions if there are any.